Hello, friend. Thanks for joining me for another book chat. Today, let's spend some time with Panpsychism in the West by David Skrbina. This revised edition was published in 2017. The book itself was originally published in 2005, I believe. But I just love these sort of kinds of books that explore human consciousness and how we humans perceive reality. And if you've watched my channel for really any length of time, you've probably seen that I have a pretty regular diet of these kinds of books. Some previous books that I've chatted here on my channel include Galileo's Error, The Phenomenon of Man, The Future of Man, and Seeing Through the World are several examples among many others. I'll link to these particular chats, though, down in the details below. So what is this particular book about, though? It's essentially a historical survey of panpsychism, the philosophy of panpsychism in Western thought over about the last 2,500 years. So it has a really long history. So in place of a spoiler warning here for this work of nonfiction, I'm going to give an amateur warning and let everybody know, just to make sure you're aware, that I am an amateur and I am not qualified to teach the subject of panpsychism as a philosophy. But even as an amateur, I really just inhaled this book. I found it so interesting and just fascinating. I'm still pondering aspects of it. So how I thought I would approach this chat is, rather than go into depth, this book actually explores many different philosophers and their different takes on different aspects of panpsychism. I thought I would just pull out a few of the various aspects that I found the most interesting while reading the book. So first off, let's start off with what a definition of panpsychism. So there's one in the book that sort of, I think, describes it pretty well, just very simple. The quote says, "On such a view, mind becomes a general and perhaps fundamental property of nature. Mind would then exist in some form in all things. Broadly speaking, this is the view known as panpsychism." So, panpsychism is a philosophy that holds that mind or consciousness is present literally in all matter. We have to be really careful, though, of the term psychism, and I think this is one of the reasons why people sort of disregard panpsychism today, is because it's got this psychism word attached to it, which gives it the spiritual or supernatural sort of connotation. At least that was my experience. And this is really not a spiritual or a religious sort of idea at all. It is a working, rational philosophy. And it has been overshadowed over the last few hundred years since the Enlightenment by this mechanistic, materialistic materialistic philosophy that we have here that's dominant for us today even. And this was really the first surprise for me, really, about reading this book, was that as a 21st century person, I really wasn't aware of the really, really long history that panpsychism, the philosophy of panpsychism, has had and continues to have. This, I mentioned our current worldview is a scientific, sort of materialist-based, mechanistic version of reality that has existed since basically the age of the Enlightenment. There's two really common aspects of current thinking that I think everybody will be familiar with, and that is that mind is limited to humans. Or maybe some people will attribute mind to the higher animals, whatever that means. And then the second thing is that mind is somehow dependent on or reducible to the physical matter of the brain. So you need a brain to have mind in the current sort of default thinking, I think, that all of us are familiar with. Panpsychism sort of doesn't really agree with that at all. It holds that all matter has mind or consciousness to some degree. Again, we have to be really careful and understand that we're not talking about maybe a stone having a human experience or experiencing the world in the way that we do, but it nevertheless has a form of mind, as does its components. Its atoms have a mind. So there is a mind in all matter, according to panpsychism, all the way from subatomic particles to plants, animals, humans, planets, galaxies, nebula, so all matter has mind in the view of panpsychism. And I just found this exploration of this topic in this book so fascinating. Giordano Bruno, the Renaissance philosopher, says, "I say then that the table is not animated as a table, nor are the clothes as clothes, but that as natural things and composites, they have within them matter and form, for example, soul. All things, no matter how small and minuscule, have in them part of that spiritual substance. For in all things there is spirit, and there is not the least corpuscle that does not contain within itself some portion that may animate it." So I just think this was so interesting about animation. So one of the key aspects of mind is movement and interacting with the environment, which we as organic beings, humans, do, as well as all living things do, but actually also inorganic matter does as well. And there's a really interesting idea that's expressed in the book that I found just really fascinating, all around sand. So if you consider a small piece of sandstone, it's a simple rock at first glance, right? You don't think much about it, just rock of sandstone, but it consists of millions and millions of grains of sand, and it's held together by a type of a silica cement. So the grains are really tightly bound in a sandstone rock, and which gives the rock its solidity and its stoneness. The book says, "The grains are held continuously in place, and strongly so, and therefore there must be an ongoing and high degree of exchange of photons at the atomic level. The rushing exchange of billions of intergrain photons maps over to state, mind, space, as a single point, the mind of the stone." So these exchanges, this interaction, sort of like you think about the interaction of the photons in this piece of sandstone as the neurons in your brain, right? As a sort of consciousness. Again, not human consciousness, but nevertheless, consciousness or mind is actually what's holding it all together. Now, if you take the same amount of sand as in the first example, and you form a heap of it onto a tabletop, since the sand is loosely piled in a heap and it's not, tightly compressed together, there's not the same degree of photon exchange. So this heap of sand then would still have mind, but it wouldn't have the same level of mind really as that of the stone, if that makes sense. So we could say that the heap was less conscious or less aware than the stone. And then if you take that heap and you vibrate the table until the little particles of sand all come apart and they're spread out across this table to where they're not touching each other, there will be even less photon exchange between the different grains of sand. And while this spread out sand would still have some exchange, it wouldn't have the same amount as the heap did. So it could be considered to be less conscious or have less awareness or less mind than the heap, which then in turn had less mind or less consciousness than the stone, if that makes sense. So I just thought that was so interesting, There's just these different ideas of aggregates that I just found fascinating through the book. There's another way that it's described. There's an author, Arthur Kessler, who wrote a book in the 60s called The Ghost in the Machine. And in that book, he describes this thing called a holon. And a holon is something that has integrity and identity while at the same time being part of some higher system. So I found this just really interesting. And another thinker who has explored this idea of holons is the integral philosopher Ken Wilber, who I have some of his stuff planned to read later this year. I've watched several of the Integral Thought YouTube videos, and I find this just that thought also fascinating. But holons, to me, I visualize this as a human body. If you think about, your atoms, so the atoms have mind, right? But they aggregate together to form molecules, which aggregate together to form cells, which aggregate together to form something like a liver. And so the liver is a holon. The liver, well, each of these actually are holons because each one is unique and discrete unto itself, but it's also part of a larger whole. And then the liver is part of me. It is me, but it's also not me. I could get someone else's liver if I need to get a liver transplant. I would still be me, but it wouldn't be that same liver. I could give my liver, I could donate my liver to another person who could use my liver. So the liver has an existence independent of me, but it's also me. And to me, I thought that was just a fascinating thing to think about. So the same thing can be said of, from like I mentioned, if you talk about cells or atoms, if we're going to talk about inorganic matter, atoms, planets, nebula, so it would be these aggregates. So the more that it's aggregated, the more conscious it would have, if that makes sense. Finally, before I run out of time, I'd like to touch on the topic of emergentism, and I have a hard time pronouncing that word, but it's emergence, because I think this is a really common it's really common in our default thinking of today. And as I mentioned earlier, we have this mechanistic view of the universe, materialistic, based on matter view of the universe that we've inherited from the past. And, most people don't grant consciousness or mind to animals. They might some people might charitably agree to say, okay, well, the primates have mind, but not cows. Or cows might have mind, but not insects. Insects might have mind, but not plants. But actually, there's no line as you go, quote unquote, down the organic chain of animals where the emergence of consciousness can be said to happen. And to me, I think that was one of the most fascinating problems that was explored, problems with modern day thinking that was explored in the book that's actually explained by Panpsychism as a philosophy. So to me, that was just so interesting. Okay, there's so much more we could chat about here, but I think I'm going to end the chat with that. It's just, I'm going to be reading more on this topic because I just find it so interesting, and there was just tons and tons of stuff in here. I just inhaled this book. It was so fun to read, and actually very readable for an amateur like me. But my next chat is going to be, let me call up the cover. My next chat is going to be some fantasy by Robert Jordan, Wheel of Time series, Book 7, A Crown of Swords, and I hope to have a guest with me on this chat, which will be coming up soon. So until next time, take care. Bye.